Good afternoon, and welcome to the IOP Speaker Series event, David Hogg, America, Activism in the Balance. My name is Robbie Latke, and I'm a second year at the college studying public policy and economics. At the IOP, I'm a member of the Student Advisory Board and a writer for The Gate. I also serve as the Communications Director for UChicago Democrats. My motivation for public service was sparked by a senseless act of gun violence in my home community of South Florida in 2018. Following the tragic shooting at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School that killed 17 people, a nationwide movement mobilized young people throughout the country. 1 month later, under a Republican-controlled state legislature, Florida passed historic gun reform legislation that included red flag laws and a ban on bump stocks, thanks in large part to the activism of the brave Marjory Stoneman Douglas students. The moment taught me that young activists can create real policy change. I am thrilled to introduce one of those activists, David Hogg, the co-founder of the March for Our Lives movement and survivor of the Parkland massacre. Just last month, he became the first Gen Z individual ever elected to Democratic Party leadership and now serves as vice chair. Moderating today's discussion is Dylan Wells, a proud alum of the college and, of course, the IOP. Dylan is now a national political reporter for the Washington Post and a member of the Post's Next Generation Initiative, where she works to engage younger and more diverse audiences, both on and off platform. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. Please make sure to turn off or silence your cell phones. And second, when it's time for Q&A, the microphone will be placed in the audience, and as always, we will give first priority to students. Last, please make sure to check out our last speaker event of the quarter, including 3 student-led events: Championing the South Side, Shannon Parker on LGBTQ justice, LGBTQ activism, which will take place at 4 p.m. on Thursday at the IOP. Next, a fireside chat on the state of U.S. diplomacy, a discussion with former ambassador to the Netherlands, Shefali Razdan Dugal, at 5:30 p.m. on Thursday. And finally, Sanctioning the Sanctuary or Stopping Grounds, Chicago in the Second Age of Trump, featuring Illinois State Rep. Cam Buckner and Professor Tom Clark at 12 p.m. this Friday at the IOP. Now please join me in welcoming David Hogg and Dylan Wells.
Welcome. Thank you all for being here with us today. We have a lot of topics to discuss, obviously your new role, but given that we're here at the University of Chicago speaking to students, I was hoping that we could start with your outside activism experience, obviously surviving Parkland, co-founding March for Our Lives. You really changed the national conversation around gun control, particularly for our generation. And I'm hoping that you could reflect on some of the lessons from that time, especially as many students in the room are figuring out how to best channel their energy under this administration.
Yeah. First of all, thank you to the university for having me. Thank you to Dylan for doing this, and to Robbie as well, obviously, who's from my neighboring city of Boca Raton, which is right next to Parkland. After Parkland happened, we were in a very similar place as a country, politically speaking, I would argue, in terms of there being a Republican trifecta, right? And after the shooting, when we decided to start speaking out, what we heard from a lot of people in the establishment, what we heard from a lot of, purported experts and consultants and other people was some version of the same message, which is that it was terrible what happened to you kids, but you don't understand. The NRA is too powerful. You can't talk about them. You can't talk about banning assault weapons because it's too unpopular. You can't talk about all these other things. You just don't understand, and you're not going to create any change, but good for you guys for even trying. And we said, we went out there and did what teenagers do best, which is the exact opposite of what we were told. And that's why we started going out there and talking about the NRA, because we had nothing else to lose. We were just teenagers, right? And in the political establishment at the time, there were very few people that were willing to actually say what needed to be said about the NRA and about the issue, and not to have this conversation on the terms of the NRA, where we did go out there and we talked about banning assault weapons. We did go out there and we talked about taking on the NRA. And as a result of that, we ended up changing the narrative on this conversation. We ended up raising the age to buy a gun in Florida to 21 because the shooter at my high school was a 19-year-old that under federal law at the time was not able to purchase a handgun because he was 19 years old, but he could purchase an AR-15 because that's the logic of the NRA, right? We raised the age to buy a gun to 21, and we passed a red flag law in our state that has been used over 19,000 times to disarm people that are at risk to themselves and others. And people still fall through the cracks. It's still not a perfect system, but we know that in those 19,000 times that I would argue thousands of lives have been saved, at least. If we didn't have the audacity to go out there and say what needed to be said, the issue would not have changed and nothing would have changed in Parkland. But as a generation, we refuse to just have people continue to send their thoughts and prayers. And I think what we did in that moment, as much as I would like to take credit because of all the work that we've done and all the sacrifice that all of myself and fellow activists have made, it's really our generation that deserves credit on that. Because we put a message out there that said, we're going to go in March. Because we decided to do this march in Washington, D.C., and we thought we were going to get 90 people to Washington with us. And when we put out the message for people to join us in that, we got over 10,000 people within our first day that signed up, and then 100,000 people and hundreds of thousands more that ended up joining us and having sister marches all over the country. And what happened is that young people finally felt, I think, like they had a voice in this conversation. The generation that grew up in the shadow of Columbine was now old enough to speak out. I was born a year after Columbine happened. So this has been going on all of Gen Z's lives, and it felt like for the first time, the generation that grew up seeing Sandy Hook, seeing so many of these other shootings, finally could say something because the kids that had just gone through it were saying that you could do something on it. And that's how we ended up creating what, from my understanding, was the largest student protest in American history, with millions of kids walking out and millions of people marching with us that culminated in one of the highest youth voter turnouts ever in 2018 in the non-presidential midterm, where we defeated more NRA-backed incumbents than ever before in American history, and has resulted in the years since with us passing the first federal gun law in 30 years and seeing the creation of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention that oversaw about a 30% reduction in gun homicides over the time period of 2023 to 2025, where we're at right now. And of course, that office has now been abolished, unfortunately. But we have made an enormous amount of progress on this issue, even if it feels like we haven't, because we're not going to hear about the shooting that doesn't happen.
You point out that you were just a teenager organizing all of this. You got attacked relentlessly.
Just a little bit.
A whole host of characters. What, looking back now with what you know now, is there anything that you would have done differently in that time, or any lessons that took a while to learn getting into this and immediately being thrust on the national stage?
Honestly, I think the only thing that I would have done differently is spent more time with my family. My sister also went through the shooting. She was 14 years old when that happened. And I think the main regret I have from that time period is how much work I was putting into this and the sacrifice that my family had to make on that. My father was also diagnosed over a decade and a half ago with early onset Parkinson's disease. And unfortunately, he passed in September, and I wish that I was able to spend more time with them through that time period and be there more for my family. I don't have any regrets about what we said and what we were doing, because we were authentic young people. And we're not going to be perfect. We're not always going to have the same thoughts years from then. But we were doing the most important thing, which was not speaking like we were a bunch of politicians or giving people a bunch of talking points. We were saying what we felt and what really needed to be done, and people resonated with that because that's what they wanted. But that's the only regret that I would say I have.
Could you talk us through what you see as next in the gun violence prevention space? I mean, to your point, there continues to be these mass school shootings. The office that was established under the Biden White House no longer exists. What are kind of the goals or targets that you see as next?
So one, there's a lot of work that we still can do at the state and local level in particular. In many cities around the country, I believe in Baltimore, over the past few years, they've seen about a 40% reduction in gun homicides, which is still nowhere near enough to be clear. We have a lot more work to do, but that is great progress that is being made. Many cities around the country, since the passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the first federal gun law that was passed after Uvalde and after Buffalo, put hundreds of millions of dollars into what are called community violence intervention programs. They also helped to hire 14,000 trained mental health and school guidance counselors to help improve the mental health system within our schools. And what I see as the pathway forward is that for too long there's been a separation on this issue where we're either talking about the demand side in why is somebody picking up a gun and pulling the trigger, or we're talking about the supply side. How is somebody getting the gun in the first place, right? You could also think about it like capability versus intent. And you need both of those in order for somebody to harm somebody else, right? I think for too long, there has not been enough nuance around this issue in the necessity of us focusing on both of those things. We need to focus on how does somebody get a gun, but simultaneously, we also need to focus on why are they picking up the gun in the first place. And this isn't just about mass shootings. Let me be clear about that. I'm talking about gun suicides, which are the vast majority of gun deaths in this country. I'm also talking about the daily gun violence that occurs in cities around the country, including here in Chicago, unfortunately. I'm also talking about the unintentional shootings where a child picks up what they think is a toy and accidentally kills themselves, right? The future of the movement, in my opinion, is regardless, if we're in a blue state, we need to make sure that we're focusing on that supply side and how we're strengthening gun laws. But if we're in a red state where it may not be possible, or politically people just may not want to do anything about the gun laws in particular, we can't let that stop us from focusing on why is somebody picking up a gun. And let me get into what I mean by that. We know that in most major cities, the people, on average, I think I was looking at it yesterday, roughly last year there were about 1,000 shooting incidents in Chicago. Right? Not in every single one of those instances, it's not that somebody is necessarily getting killed. There can still be people that are injured, and sometimes it's just an instance where miraculously bullets miss people and nobody dies because it was, for example, a drive-by shooting. That means there's about 1,000 individuals that are, in that case, the most likely to be the perpetrators of gun violence. We have to figure out how we can work to get wraparound social services around the people that are most likely to be the perpetrators of gun violence so that they don't feel the need to pick up a gun in the first place. Because so much of it, what drives it is poverty. What drives it is hopelessness. What drives it is trauma. Because we know the biggest predictor of who shoots somebody else in this country is whether or not that person has been shot before or whether that person knows somebody who has been shot before. And it makes sense, right? Because it's retaliation. And what we need to do in the future of the movement is focus on that demand side. Why, when somebody comes into a hospital that is a victim of gun violence, why are they not immediately met with a therapist and counselor and faith leader and other support from social services in that hospital to stop the retaliation from happening immediately and not just perpetuating the incarceration that is also not solving this problem? Because if it was, I wouldn't be talking to you right now, right? And we have to focus on getting those social services wrapped around the people that are most likely to be the perpetrators of gun violence, not only because it is one of the most effective ways of combating it, but because it is also, and I hate to put it in these terms, it is far more cheaper for taxpayers to prevent a shooting than it is to respond to one and then incarcerate somebody and separate a family for decades after that. Right? Investing a little bit up front in prevention can go a lot further than just responding to these shootings over and over again. And what I think we have to do is realize that we cannot just focus on the gun law. That is a very important part, and that will always be my top priority, but we must focus on why is somebody picking up a gun in the first place. And to add to that, the biggest predictor of where shootings occur in the United States is where communities were redlined by the federal government in the 1930s and 40s. Injustice drives so much of the gun violence in this country, whether it's the poverty that drives it, the systemic racism that drives it, or so much more. And we can't continue to act like we should only focus on how does somebody get a gun, although we do need to focus on that. We have to focus on both.
So you entered politics through the outside, through this activism. And then just recently you were elected by the members of the DNC to serve as vice chair. How does your past kind of outside-in organizing inform how you're now thinking about this new role within the party?
Look, I think people, the reason why I ran for this role, more than anything, was when I was in the executive committee, there was an executive committee meeting of the DNC that was open to the public. And I wanted to attend it to see how things were running and what they were talking about in the wake of the election. And when Molly, our pollster, talked about why we lost, the first thing she brought up was 18 to 29-year-old voters. But when I looked around the room, I didn't see anybody under the age of 30, probably under the age of 40, to be honest with you. And I saw an opportunity for myself as somebody who helped to build March for Our Lives, to help register tens of thousands of young people to vote, had done so much work in youth voter participation, to be the change that I wanted to see, because there was nobody else running in that role that was under the age of 30, that also, there just wasn't anybody that represented that demographic. So I knew I was in a unique position to be able to help with that, and that's why I decided to run. What I bring to this role is I am not here to tell people what they want to hear. And that does not make me a lot of friends. But I believe it can bring our party to a place of making more progress to help address all the issues, including gun violence, but going beyond gun violence as well, that we have to address to successfully address the issue of gun violence. And one example of why I decided to run for it is that I wanted to make sure that when people asked, for example, in the candidate forums that we had when I was running for this position, when I decided to run, I said, I am not going to contort myself and lie to people and try to create some bullshit mirage of talking points, like no offense to the politicians that are out there, but some bullshit mirage of talking points that basically results in me saying something, but ultimately saying nothing at all, because I'm just hoping that people will look at it and somehow see what they want to see without actually me saying anything at all. And that's why when people ask me, why did we lose the election, I was upfront in saying, well, look, voters told us two things more than anything else, predominantly, which was that prices were too high and Joe Biden was too old. And with the power of $2 billion behind us, we said to voters, no, he's not, and no, they aren't. When you tell voters not to believe their eyeballs or their wallets, you're going to lose them. It's not rocket science, right? You don't need a massive spreadsheet of 360 million data, 100 million data points out there to explain that to you. It's just common sense. And I wanted to be somebody in that room that is willing to say the thing that needs to be said, even if it is not very popular, because as Democrats, we can continue to choose to live in a comfortable delusion where we hope that if we just throw enough money at the Philadelphia media market and make enough consultants rich enough that it's going to solve all of our problems and we don't need to change ourselves, or we can actually address the fact that right now our party is at an incredibly low level of support, historically speaking, and we can either address that and acknowledge it and work on reestablishing trust with people and being honest with them, or we can continue to lose, but still get to keep all of our titles. I want to be in this position to tell people what they need to hear, even if it's not necessarily what they want to hear. And it's a very risky thing to do, but I'm not here for the title. I'm here to win.
Well, speaking of the title, to step back, what exactly even is a vice chair of the DNC?
Great question.
And what have you been up to the first couple weeks in this role?
So, it's really interesting. The vice chair role, there are four of us. And there are four of us, and only one of us has a specific role that is outlined, and that is the chair of civic engagement and voter participation. You can imagine what that person focuses on. The other three roles, they don't have a specific definition. Mm-hmm. So what we do now is we go to the chair, Ken Martin, and we say, this is our portfolio of things that we want to work on to help advance the mission of the party. For me, that thing is really, how do we rebuild trust with our young people and not do it in a way where it's vote for Democrats because we're not Republicans. Well, I'm going to get into that in a second. But that answers your question of what we do, what our roles are as vice chairs. It is not a paid role, by the way, at all. And your other question was, what have I done over these first few weeks? I've spent time on the phone with a lot of people, in particular with a lot of the people that have been the most critical of me publicly. Because I'm not going to go out and say, I don't think it's good for the party, for us as such a big tent with a lot of people in the center, a lot of people on the left, and everywhere in between, to be having this discourse in public and arguing with each other. So when I see somebody that says something about me, instead of me tweeting at them, I call them up and say, hey, how can we get back to winning the House? How can we acknowledge that we have our differences, but ultimately we have the same goal here of winning the House so that we can actually have power to do anything at all in the first place? So that's been a lot of my conversations. I also, in one of those, before I ran, I tweeted out something where I talked about Congresswoman Mary Peltola, who lost her race. Congresswoman Peltola had voted against, she was one of 2 Democrats to vote in favor of a bill that would permanently abolish the Office of Gun Violence Prevention that survivors had spent 4+ years fighting to create with the administration and the campaign. It would permanently abolish it, and it would defund it forever for all future administrations. And this is an office that effectively, just to give you a context of what it did, it wasn't necessarily going out there and saying to Congress, like, this is all the new laws you need to do. More than anything, it was helping to enforce laws that we had already created, to coordinate the federal government's response to gun violence, to make sure that if a state had tens of millions of dollars it could take from the Safer Communities Act, that it actually could take, that they did take it, because bureaucracy is complicated and sometimes you need to cut through that red tape. And it also was effectively kind of like FEMA for mass shootings and instances of gun violence. So for example, when there was a shooting in Lewiston, Maine, they could be there talking with different members of the community, organizing the state, local, and federal government's response, and also addressing what the survivors need in that instance for therapy needs and other things like that. And what I posted about Congresswoman Peltola was I said something that I don't agree with now, but I said it from obviously the issue is very personal to me. I said, look, good riddance. This shows that being bad on guns will not save you. And let me be clear, I wish that Congresswoman Peltola did win, and I shouldn't have said that. But at the same time, I wish that she still voted. She didn't vote for that bill. And I actually called her after my win because I wasn't going to call her as I was running for this position, because it could come off as insincere, it could come off as opportunistic, and I called her after I won, and I apologized for it. And we had a very good conversation. She accepted my apology. But that's been a lot of the conversations that I've been having, is figuring out how I can be the best team player that I can be in our party so we can move forward to getting a majority in the House and actually having the power to do anything at all, which right now we're very limited in doing in the first place. And talking to a lot of frontline candidates as well, talking to state party chairs like that of Wyoming, people like Adam Frisch, and other people that are in frontline seats to ask them, what can we learn from your experience, even if we aren't completely aligned in what we think the party should be promoting, what can we learn from your experience in order to get us back on track to winning?
To your point there, some Democrats have expressed their concern that you provide an unhelpful foil for the Republican Party because of some of the ideas you've expressed over the years. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, you have Republicans who have celebrated your election to this role. You had Alex Brusewitz, who was one of the main Gen Z advisors for Trump. He called you a dork and not cool, and said that he tried to bait you into running for this role because it was better for Republicans if you were in it.
How did he say that he baited me? I don't even know who that is.
Okay, you don't know who he is, for the record.
No.
How do you respond to that kind of criticism, and why do you feel like this role of vice chair within the DNC is the best way for you to help the party?
Because I want to be somebody in this role where it is always easy to talk about what we're doing wrong as a party. Democrats love to do that. It is the easy thing to do. What's much harder is to talk about what are we going to do differently to actually improve where we are as a party. And in this role, I hope to show that even with somebody like myself, who I would describe as very progressive, how we can work across the aisle within our own party, within the broad tent that we have, to work towards the collective goal of getting back to having a majority and addressing some of the real issues that I think are holding us back. Because I don't even think so much of it is, I think policy in some contexts certainly can be part of it. But I think more than anything, one of the biggest issues that we have as a party is our tone. We come off as extremely condescending to people and disrespectful to them. We look down on them. And this is my own opinion. And I've realized this through my own experience when I was in college and I joined the shooting club. As you can imagine, I was extremely popular there. And when I joined the club, the reason why I did that is because I didn't go to college to surround myself with people who think like me, right? When I applied to college, I literally talked about how I believe the most important thing that I can do with my degree is getting a better education to combat the disinformation and lies that fuel so much of the hatred and division on this issue of gun violence. And I talked about my own experience talking with armed counter-protesters in Dallas, Texas, who were screaming that I was a crisis actor, that I was here to take everybody's guns, and how through a conversation that I had with them where I said, look, I know you don't agree with me, but I can't accept the fact that you don't want school shootings to continue either, right? That as we talked more about what we could agree on, they ended up crying because they realized the people that they were protesting were human beings first. I was 18 years old when that happened. I was basically still a child. And through a series of conversations that I've had both voluntarily and involuntarily in this role, what I've realized is that whenever there's somebody that comes to me and says something terrible to me or some kind of expletive to me online or in person or something like that, my response used to be, when I was 18 years old and it was in the immediate aftermath of the shooting, used to be to, cuss them out. It used to be to call them names and say all these things and say, and justifiably so, if somebody is saying the shooting at your high school did not happen and that you're a paid actor here to take everybody's guns, I would argue you're justified in cussing that person out, right? But ultimately, is that going to move us forward, right? Because I'm not here just to have that comfortable conversation. I'm here to live in an uncomfortable reality where we actually might be able to make progress on this issue. And every time somebody says something like that to me, my response now is, look, I can respect that you don't agree with me. I can respect that you don't, for example, want to ban a gun like the AR-15, even though I think that we should. But what I can't accept is the fact that you don't want school shootings or gun violence to continue either. So is there any amount of evidence or data or statistics that I could provide you that would change your mind? And almost universally, they say no, because they don't want to have their minds changed. And I say, great, well, then I'm not going to bother debating you. So how about instead we focus on what we can agree on? For example, 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. Do you think we need more mental health funding for that? And they almost always say yes. I'm like, great, and we agree on that. And we have a few more conversations about other things that we could probably agree on, maybe some stuff around red flag laws, for example. And every single conversation I have had like that with somebody online or even in person, the person every time ends up apologizing to me and says, David, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you, but I was wrong for saying that. And what I used to think is that you have to fully convince somebody of your opinion in order to win, or else it's a total lost cause. But that is not how we should think about this. Because even though I'm not fully convincing somebody, if I can get them to fight me less hard, that is still progress, right? If I can get them to see that maybe their worldview isn't entirely correct because I don't hate them as a human being, then they might come to me in the future and say, actually, I have changed my mind. And that has happened, even with people who said that the shooting at my high school didn't happen in the past. They came to me after Uvalde when I talked over and over again and said that same message of, look, we have to do something here. We all agree we need to address this issue. So there were people that came to me that said, I'm sorry that I said that the shooting at your high school didn't happen. I shouldn't have said that, and I actually agree with you now. But the problem is, if we continue this course of just thinking that yelling at somebody is the best way of changing their mind, and believe me, there is a time and a place for that, right? When there are morally outrageous things happening. But in the interpersonal conversations, just calling somebody names or saying it's not my job to educate you, I'm sorry, if you work in politics, it is your job to educate people if you want to make change, period. And I understand why some people may not want to do that. I would say that politics is not for you if you want to help make change, and that's okay. But that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in this role so much, both inside of our party, is acknowledge, like, look, I'm not here to compromise my values for you, and I'm not asking you to compromise yours for me. I'm asking us to figure out what progress we can make together to get back to winning the House, or if it's a Republican or an NRA supporter, how we can make progress on combating gun violence, even if it's in a small way. Because I know we are not as divided as we actually think we are on this issue. And as we continue to debate it, people die. And I'm tired of having that debate.
So let's talk about the 2024 election. Harris lost. There was a rightward shift almost everywhere in the country. The popular vote, the battlegrounds, the House and Senate. What lessons do you take away for Democrats from that loss?
One is that the president needed to not run again. Two is that, let me just talk about Kamala Harris for a second. I think she did a remarkable job given the situation she was put in. An impossible situation, and she did a damn good job given the situation that she was put in. I think part of what has happened, though, is that there has been, people do not feel heard by the party. I think no matter what the issue is, universally, that is in my opinion, the string that ties all this together. They do not feel heard by us. They do not feel like many people feel like we do not care about them. And when I was in this run for vice chair and people asked me this question, what I would say, like I said earlier, is that when people came to us and said, Joe Biden's too old or prices are too high, we said, no, they aren't, and no, he's not. That's not an effective message. You got to address what people are actually seeing. You got to address the reality that they're living in. And it's not to say that it's not to say that that we're to blame for all those things. Obviously, Joe Biden was old, but we could have talked about the fact that Trump added so much to our national debt in just 4 years, and that's going to have an inflationary effect. We didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about, what about all of the corporations that are buying up tens of thousands of single-family homes around the country to raise the price on the working class and the working poor, effectively to push them out of ever achieving the dream of owning a home in this country. And I think, honestly, part of what we need to do going forward is, one, we got to be honest with people and acknowledge when things are not going right. If there's an issue at the border, I think that we need to address it, but we need to do it in a humane way where we acknowledge the fact that we are a country of immigrants, and we're not going to meet this with draconian measures of sending people to Guantanamo Bay, right? We're going to meet it with compassion and address the reasons why people are coming here, which, to the administration's credit, I think in many ways we did, but we failed to communicate about. Because we had a commander-in-chief, but we did not have a communicator-in-chief. And that is one of the most important roles of the president. We did accomplish an enormous amount at the domestic level. And that's part of what kills me, is that so many of the issues that young people in particular say that we care about, on climate, on guns, so many things domestically, we did advance massively. But we failed to communicate what we did. And unfortunately, just doing the work is not enough, especially when you're dealing with the fire hose that is Donald Trump, that is out there constantly and isn't going through 12 layers of vetting to be like, well, can he go on this podcast? It's our failure to communicate what we did, and also our failure for people to feel like we actually listened to them, because when they told us prices were high, we said, look at the GDP. We treated it like, and no offense to the grad students in the room, we treated it like it was a master's in public policy program where we're going to talk about all these macroeconomic figures instead of actually saying, well, what are we going to do about it, right? And why is this happening? And you're going to lose people when that is the case, when they don't feel heard by you. And part of what I'm trying to do in this role is listen to a lot of people, even those who don't agree with me, and figure out how we can move forward as a party by being more honest and also building a positive vision for the Democratic Party, where people should be voting for us, not because we're not Republicans, but because we're damn Democrats and we deliver, because we're competent, we're effective, and we're good communicators. And we fight for what we believe in, we don't compromise our values, and ultimately we deliver for the people that we claim to fight for, right? That is why they should be voting for us. And I think what has happened is that our party is still in part living in the 20th century of how to communicate, where young people are not watching cable news or CNN or MSNBC. They're watching podcasts, they're watching social media, and we have got to get better at communicating with them in those places, and not with weird astroturfing where it's like, well, vote for Democrats because if you don't, you're a terrible person, but vote for us because this is how we're delivering for you.
You've talked about meeting Biden before the election. You met with him one-on-one and had a conversation where he asked you what he could do to win young people. And you've shared since the election that you regret not saying that he should step aside. Can you talk us through that conversation and that moment and why you felt you couldn't share that view at that time?
I think, one, it's because I was meeting with the President of the United States. And And two, even if I do wish that I said that because maybe it would have made some small momentum towards that, but ultimately, I have an enormous amount of respect for him at the same time, and it's hard to hold those two things because he did accomplish so much on the issue that I care most about. He did. We asked him to do all of these things, and he delivered. He delivered the first gun law in 30 years. He delivered the Office of Gun Violence Prevention. He was an incredibly effective person in getting legislation done in Congress and advancing our domestic policy agenda. That was part of the challenge, along with the fact that, frankly, anybody that did speak out about that was immediately ostracized in our party. They were, right? And I know that we like to claim that we're not a cult, but anybody who did say that President Biden was too old basically had their career destroyed. That's a problem. We are the Democratic Party. We are supposed to have open conversations and dialogues about this stuff, as uncomfortable as it might be, and realize if the vast majority of voters are telling us basically one thing about the president, we probably should listen to the vast majority of voters when they're telling us that and not just say, no, they don't understand. They do understand. And I think universally part of the problem that we have, and this is not isolated to President Biden's administration, it's every administration. People are incentivized to do whatever keeps them in their position of power in the White House and in their position of influence, even if it means everybody losing it if the problem is not addressed like President Biden's age, like we are right now, right? Like all the people who said like, no, we're gonna keep doing all this stuff to make sure that everything's good and we don't need to talk about the president's age, now they don't have a job, right? What good does that do? But the reality is if any single one of them spoke up about it, they probably wouldn't have kept their job and they would have been ostracized and effectively excommunicated from the party. That is a huge problem. And that is, if there are many lessons we need to learn from this election, but that is one of the main ones that we have to learn is that we cannot be a cult. And we have to understand that there's going to be a diversity of opinions in this party. And it's possible to both have an enormous amount of respect for what President Biden did in advancing a lot of the issues that we cared about, that on guns and climate and so many other things, while also knowing that he may not be the right person to run again for this position. And unfortunately, it put the vice president in a, I would argue, almost impossible situation. That she still did the best that she could in that position, but the timing was just not right.
I want to hone in on young voters, which is something we both care a lot about. Young voters voted for Harris over Trump in 2024 by just 4 points, 51% to 47%. In 2020, Biden defeated Trump with young voters by more than 25 points. Why? What's that gap?
Well, one, it's a turnout problem. It's a number of problems. There was a shift to the right that we saw with young voters. So one thing that's interesting is young people 18 to 29 years old, they voted about 50% in 2020. It was, I think it was the highest youth voter turnout since like 1900, essentially. I would argue the highest youth voter turnout since we've actually had a real democracy. But we saw this election an 8-point drop-off, roughly. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the data that I've seen said it was about an 8-point drop-off, so it was about 42% of young people that voted and 8% that just did not, that previously did. Part of what has happened is that there's a bifurcation within Gen Z that our party is, I think, starting to finally grapple with and acknowledge, obviously. But we like to say all the time that we can't treat certain groups as monoliths, and I agree with that. Gen Z is one of those groups. Based off the data that I've seen, the age cohort of 18 to 24-year-olds shifted about 22 points to the right. The age cohort that was 25 to 29, they shifted 4 points to the right. We cannot talk to those two groups in the same way. Part of why I believe that happened is COVID. Mm-hmm. I know we had the right intentions when we shut everything down because we were trying to be very cautious and save lives and protect so many immunocompromised people and other vulnerable communities, and that was, the right thing to do. Of course, hindsight is 20/20 now that we have the data that we have, but the reality is if a young person's first interaction with the government in a negative way that they really remember is that you can't go to prom, that you have to wear a mask, that you can't see your friends, that you can't go to graduation, you can't go to homecoming, you can't do all of these major milestones of being a young American, you're not going to like the government, right? Even though it was Trump that started a lot of that, it's Democrats that got the blame. And I think part of what happened with that is it compounded on top of a generation that was already chronically online, and I'm guilty of that myself, obviously. But as they were further isolated online, it only put gasoline on the fire of gender polarization that we've been seeing globally. We're in every country that is developed, we're seeing, men and women vote in largely opposite directions increasingly. And as they got online more and these young men got online more, they felt even more isolated, and they started looking at a lot of these influencers like Andrew Tate and other people, and it dragged them further to the right. It felt like it gave them a voice, somebody to blame, right? Even though it was not the people that they ended up blaming. And the other thing is that I think we're living through a really interesting time where back when it was George Bush and that era of conservatism, the Mitt Romney era and things like that, it was very morally superior, right? It was kind of condescending, looking down on you, saying like, if you don't go to church, you're the problem. If you do drugs, you were the problem. If you pay for somebody's abortion, for example, or somebody who has one, like you're immoral and you're wrong and you're all these other things. And it's a lot of like finger pointing and waving and saying like you're a bad person. What happened, in my opinion, is that when Donald Trump got elected, our country went into anaphylaxis about how problematic this man was, but we couldn't control him. So our response was to start changing it within our culture and policing other people, understandably. But the result was that even though we may have been right in how we were talking to a lot of these younger men, in that the things that they were saying were problematic, what ended up happening was them feeling like we don't care about them, that we look down on them, that we judge them, and effectively we adopted a lot of the moral superiority shtick that Republicans had for 30 years. That became the culture. And what has happened since COVID is, in my viewpoint, for these younger people, conservatism has become a counterculture. Weirdly enough, against the social justice, against all these other things. And it is inherently going to be more appealing to a lot of young people to be part of a counterculture, to resist the system, to resist the norm, than it is to be part of that norm in the first place. And I think with young men in particular, who we saw, I think it was a 28-point shift in total to the right. I think with young men, our party has a real problem that we have to solve. If you go to the party's website, at least during the election, if you went to the party's website, there's all this stuff about what do we do for women? What do we do for this demographic, for LGBT people, for this person, for this? Nothing about men at all. And I understand why. Our party has a taboo of thinking like empathy is a zero-sum game, that if we're talking about what we're doing to help young men, that is inherently to the detriment of young women. But I think that is a fundamentally flawed dichotomy that we have to go against, because if we isolate our young men more and they continue to feel worse, it is going to get worse for everybody. And we got to figure out how to bring them in. And what's happened is they would rather be, I don't think that most of them actually agree with Donald Trump, even if they did vote for him. I think what has happened is they would rather be around somebody and support somebody who they don't completely agree with, but they know won't judge them as much, than somebody that they agree with but feel like they're going to be judged constantly by, if that makes sense.
Covering young voters this election, talking to young voters in all the battlegrounds the last 2 years, they were sharing a very different message than those in DC, involved with some of the top Gen Z political groups that in some ways became effectively surrogates for the Biden and then Harris campaign during the election. What do you make of that disconnect, and how are you as vice chair going to make sure that the people who are making the decisions in DC are getting an accurate representation of where young people in the country are?
Well, like I said, I'm not in this position to make people happy or to get a position in some future administration or something like that. I'm here to win, because we have to do that in order to save lives. And what I plan on doing in this role is making sure that the message to young people cannot be to vote for Democrats because we're just not Republicans. It needs to be, this is how we're building, this is how we are rebuilding, for example, the American dream that so many of you feel like is a lie at this point, where you're not going to be able to own a home, where you're not going to, even if you do all the right things that your parents have told you your entire life, you're still fucked. Pardon my French, right? If you go to college, you're going to graduate with several $100,000 in student debt. If you do graduate, your job is not going to pay you that well. Everything is more expensive. You're also going to have to deal eventually with the elder care crisis of dealing with your parents and the child care crisis of how much it costs for both of those that we still have not successfully addressed as a country, and offering them a vision of how Democrats are working to rebuild the American dream by fighting against the 1% that have taken it from them, and how we are working to actively deliver it for them, whether that's making it easier to build housing, whether it's easier to make more walkable cities, or it's simply making it easier to have a family in this country, which increasingly, to far too many, feels like a luxury rather than just something that anybody could do.
We have a lot of students in the room, and I want to make sure we have time for their questions. So if you want to go ahead and kick us off.
Hi, well, thank you so much for being here. My name is Christopher. I'm a fourth year in the college. My question to you is, you've advocated for bans on AR-15s and by extension semi-automatic weapons in the past. Will you commit to condemning any Democratic politician or politician from either side, frankly, including Democratic politicians, who uses a semi-automatic weapon in his or her security detail? Why should you or someone in your clique or your party be allowed to defend themselves with such weapons when you advocate for the removal of the right of private citizens to do the same thing? And if that's your position, why should anybody trust you or vote for the Democrats?
So in particular, I think the part of the distinction here is that we're in an arms race as a country right now, right? Where part of the reason why they have those weapons is because there's so many of them within the public in the first place. And in my view, if you have an enormous amount of training, if you're part of the Secret Service, that is an inherently different amount of training and experience that you have than a 19-year-old like the shooter at my high school who's going and purchasing an AR-15 with a massive amount of rigorous training and requirements to be able to use that weapon. And frankly, if we had the same requirements for people being in the Secret Service as we did for anybody to purchase an AR-15 in this country, look, I'm fine with that personally. If we had that level of rigorous training requirements and screening of them, I am okay with that because I know somebody like the shooter at my high school is not going to be able to have that gun. But in the meantime, that's my viewpoint.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And can you please introduce yourself with your question?
Hi, I'm Camila. I'm a third year in the college. I'm studying public policy and economics, and I'm originally from Washington, D.C. You spoke a little bit about your situation with Maria Piltola, but I was wondering what policy positions do you think, or do you want to see Democrats take in primarily red states versus primarily blue states, and do you think that those should differ, or should the main idea be the same?
I think it depends on the state. Alaska is so much different even from Wyoming. This is not, in Alaska, they don't just have rural communities, they have remote communities. We're talking communities that you cannot get to because there is not a road to that community. That is the level of remoteness that we are talking about. And obviously the policy in Alaska, I understand why somebody feels the need to have a firearm in Alaska, right? If there's nobody for miles around and you also need it just to feed yourself and protect yourself, I understand why that is the case. And what I would say is that I'm going to lean on the people in each one of those communities to talk about what is the best way that we can reduce gun violence while still ensuring that Democrats have a viable pathway to victory in those areas. And I understand that in a state like Wyoming, for example, even if Democrats, when Democrats do win to some extent there, that they're very likely not going to have the majority, right? I hope that's not a surprise to anybody in this room. I don't think it's a surprise to the Wyoming Democrats either, right? But how can we, in the meantime, as a party, not assume that simply because we can't do something about gun laws means that we can't do anything about gun violence? There's a lot of work that we can do on suicide prevention programs, on mental health funding, and so much more. And we need to acknowledge the fact that the deaths by suicide are deaths of despair that are happening. And it's a product of the injustice that many rural communities face, the disinvestment that they face, and also the effects that big ag has on them. And I could go on and on about this. But I'm going to lean on the people in those communities that are running there to best know their communities and what they need, which obviously I know that they don't want gun violence or gun suicides to continue there either. So I'm going to work with them to figure out, well, even if you can't do a lot in your state legislature or as a member of Congress there, what can you do, whether it's research funding or other programmatic funding to help reduce the number of gun deaths while they're out there?
Thank you.
Hello, David. Thank you for being here. My name is Juan.
Can you speak closer to the mic?
Yes. My name is Juan. I'm a fourth year at the college. I actually grew up also in Broward County. I went to high school in Southwest Ranches. So my question is, as I did high school in South Florida and the 2020 election came, there was a notable gap between how the Democratic Party did in the elections and then the gap with ballot initiatives, with issues that are often associated with the Democratic Party.
Yes.
You have minimum wage, marijuana, etc. That's a pattern that continued in 2024 with abortion or limits in spending in elections. So my question is, now that you have a position at the national level Democratic Party, how do you hope to bridge that gap between party messaging and individual issues that have been proven to be often more associated with the Democratic Party and be winning issues at the individual ballot level?
Well, I think the point that you bring up is really important because there's this conversation that we have that happens after every election, in particular that we lose, where people talk about, well, does the party need to go more to the right? Does the party need to go more to the left? What do we do? I think what those ballot measures, at least in the case of Florida, I can't say that those obviously, the way a ballot measure is applied in Florida does not affect, it is not indicative of what people in other states believe, but at least in the case of Florida and the states where we have seen those ballot measures on abortion and other things like that succeed, what that indicates to me is the issue with the Democratic Party is not our policies so much as it is our brand. And the fact that people feel like we do not care about them or that we don't listen to them and we aren't able to deliver for them. And in my view, that is the thing that we have to work on the most, is what are we doing to address that brand, to show people when we actually do pass legislation that it was because of us, right? The fact that a Republican is able to show up at a bridge opening that was created by the infrastructure bill that we passed, that Donald Trump could have spent literally it was like the lowest hanging fruit that he could have done for 4 years, and he still failed to do it because he cannot legislate. That is why he's trying to be a king, by the way, is because he can't be a president. We have to work on the brand and reconnecting with people that those are issues that we're fighting for. And when we do pass them, that is because of us. And that is why you should vote for us, is because we are delivering a $15 minimum wage. And we aren't going to let the fucking parliamentarians stand in the way of that, right? That's a very wonky piece of context. But we're going to do everything we can to deliver on those issues. And I think more than anything, we have to show people we're going to fight for them and that we're not hiding, that we're not afraid to say what we believe in. Because right now, if you ask people in a focus group what the most, if the Democratic Party was an animal, you know what the most common answer is? It's a turtle. You know what it is for Republicans? It's a lion or a shark or some form of apex predator. People want somebody who fights for them. I want to build a Democratic Party that fights, that doesn't compromise on its values, and actually delivers for people. And that's why people vote for us, because they know that we give a damn about them and we deliver for them, not just because we're not Republicans. So.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. I'm Julia. I'm a third year in the college. You mentioned earlier in this discussion that you have had to have conversations with people who disagreed with you on issues that are fundamentally core to your personal identity and life experience. What advice would you give to help people from marginalized communities and identity groups approach people who actively wish harm to them with respect and empathy in order to change their minds?
You know, the only context I can speak to that from my own experience, is what I've been as a survivor of gun violence with other community members that have worked on it. One, I would say it's incumbent on allies of those communities to ask what we can do for them, not to go to them and say, this is how we're going to save you or some other kind of bullshit like that. Don't ever do that, by the way. Just ask. You know, if you can be an ally, if you are in one of those more privileged groups, what can you do to support them? Because sometimes it might be nothing, right? If they say that to you, and then you have to accept that. What I will say is, just based off of my own experience, is figuring out how you can form some kind of a rapport with that person ultimately, and realizing that we don't need to convince everybody. Let me be clear, when I talk about the necessity of us talking to people who disagree with us, I'm not saying that we need to talk to white supremacists and be like, no, they're going to change. No, that is not what I'm getting at. That is not what I'm getting at. There's a lot of nuance in this conversation. We don't need to focus on that person, right? What we need to focus on are the people that believe that there is a fence to stand on when there are instances of injustice that are happening, and showing them there is no fence, right? You are on one side, or you're on the side of justice, or you're not. And all we need to do is get to, I wouldn't want it to just be 51%. I'd want it to be closer to 60% of that population. But you don't need to talk to those most extreme groups that are going to be endangering those communities the most in order to be able to do that, I would argue personally. And that is how I would say that we need to focus on having that conversation. But I can't go and say specifically, well, if you're of this identity, this is how you should go and talk. I can't say that because I'm not of that identity, and I acknowledge that. What I can say is, from my own experience, is if you are not of one of those marginalized identities, just ask how you can help, and not only ask, but listen, and humbly work with them to help them.
Thank you.
Next.
Hello, I'm Daryl. I really appreciated hearing you talk a lot about how to engage young voters in the future elections to come, as in your strategies you hope to employ as vice chair. I'm from Orlando. My congressional district, I'm very proud to have voted for the first Gen Z member of Congress, Maxwell Alejandro Frost. What strategies, or what do you hope to do as vice chair to make sure that we have more Maxwell Alejandro Frost in Congress, or more Gen Z lawmakers on all levels of government, from local, federal, state?
It's almost like I planted this question. I didn't.
And I've seen a lot of the organizing work you've done with Gen Z lawmakers. Thank you for that. I was just interested in hearing about how you hope to do that now that you're in a position of power within the Democratic Party.
Look, so great question. This is exactly what I've been working on for the past 2 or so years with my organization, Leaders We Deserve. Right? We have a generation of young people that activated with March for Our Lives, that walked out of their schools, that participated in these protests, that are now old enough to have either graduated college, or if they didn't go to college, are old enough to run for office nonetheless. When I was helping Maxwell on his campaign, because I hired Maxwell from my freshman dorm room in college, actually, to work for March for Our Lives. And the first time he turned me down for the job, and then I flunked a Spanish test because I'm dyslexic. And I said, Maxwell, you don't understand. I need you to take this job so I can finish this class and graduate. And then he took the job. And he called me up 2 years later, told me he wanted to run for Congress, and I said, it's fine, I passed Spanish. And Maxwell had to Uber drive every night from 9 p.m. to 2 a.m. While running against 2 former members of Congress, and I think it was 5 other people. I had to help him raise $400,000 in his first 2 quarters. Maxwell is not from a very well politically connected family. He didn't go to a very fancy college. He didn't, his family is very middle class, and he's not rich. And what I saw the opportunity for after Maxwell won was to create something kind of like an Emily's List, but for young Democrats running for state legislature and Congress. So I talked to Maxwell's campaign manager, and we decided to create an organization that's a PAC and super PAC called Leaders We Deserve that supports young Democrats running for state legislatures and Congress. And what we've done with that is we've helped elect the youngest person to 4 different chambers around the country last cycle. And one of them was a young man named Bryce Berry in Georgia, who got involved with March for Our Lives in 2018. That was how he got involved in politics. And after he graduated college, he decided to run for Georgia state legislature. And we came in, supported him in that campaign, did fundraisers with him, worked with him, advised him, and he ended up getting elected to become the youngest person ever elected in Georgia state history at the age of 23. So that is a lot of the work that we're doing. We also supported Congresswoman Sarah McBride as well. And we're planning on doing a lot more work this cycle to support young Democrats running. Leaders We Deserve doesn't support candidates that take corporate money. And I understand that's a different viewpoint from the entirety of the party and also all of our candidates. But in my viewpoint, I want to show young people that there is somebody there that is specifically there to fight for them, whose only interest is their interest and is not owned by a corporation. Because I don't think that that money should have any role in politics, frankly. And I don't want to advocate for unilateral disarmament, frankly, because there's so much money involved in politics right now, especially somebody like Elon Musk. But we have to show that there are people there that do not have that conflict of interest, that also young people can believe actually do represent them, in the first place. So that's why we created Leaders We Deserve. And if any of you guys want to run for state legislature or Congress that are under the age of 30, let me know after this.
Thank you.
We have limited time remaining, so we'll try to do these last few questions a bit rapid fire.
All right, thank you, David, for coming to speak with us today. My question was, some of the criticism that you've drawn and lots of other progressives have drawn is that you're too far to the left to appeal to people in the center. And I was wondering how you kind of respond to that, if that's kind of something that you think actually alienates voters. And if so, why is it that this is so much of a conversation around people on the left when there are many members of the right who openly associate themselves with Nazis and white nationalists, and it doesn't seem to affect them politically? Oh, and I'm Zach, fourth year.
Yeah. Look, I think, in my opinion, what drives vote, part of the issue that I have with polling is that I think to some extent it can be a good measure of where voters actually are on issues, obviously. But in my own experience, I have to tell you, what impacts what somebody believes over the long term far more than just what a policy is, and there's limits to this, obviously, like if there's something way to the left or way to the right, like you're gonna just lose voters. But more than anything, I look at somebody like Jared Golden, for example, who previously, he's a congressman in Maine, very purple district, tough district to win in. Our frontline candidates go through hell, and I do not envy them at all. But he was running, he's in this district, and for a long time, he was not a supporter of the assault weapons ban at all. And then unfortunately, there was the shooting that happened in Lewiston, Maine, and after that, he changed his mind. And he still won his re-election. I can't say this for sure, but I think it was at least by the same margin, if not a wider margin. And I think part of the reason for that is because he understands his community, right? And that is one of the things that we need to focus on more than anything, like I said, is our brand. People do not feel like we listen to them, in my opinion. People do not feel like we care about them. And regardless, to a large extent, in my opinion, of what somebody's policy priorities are, if they feel like you don't care about them, as a member of Congress, state legislator, whatever it is, whatever position you're in, they're not going to vote for you. And I think that is the thing that we have to focus on the most, is showing in districts like Jared Golden's how you can support a policy like that if you have the connection to your community, that you can win. Because that's what people care about more than anything, is, are you there to fight for me? Do you care about me? Do you see me? And that is what we got to focus on as a party, and highlighting when there are candidates that do win in districts like that as well, that they can take those bold stances and they will still win if they have the right connections with their community in the first place. Because I think so often it's about how we talk about these policies, right? And having that connection with the community.
Sure. Thank you.
Hi, David. Thanks for being here. My name is Matt. I'm a third-year medical student, first year in the MPP. And not all of us are super wonky, I will say, in Masters of Public Policy program. Hopefully not, at least. I guess my question is, I think it's really great, the work that you're doing with folks who want to run for office. I guess I'm curious what you think, especially in your role as vice chair of DNC, what the party can do to focus on rank and file young voters, and in particular, like what are concrete steps that are going to be taken, and what do you plan to take in the next several months to actually engage folks and get them back to organizing? I mean, I think we've seen like a huge fall off in resistance this time around to Trump, and I'm not surprised by that, given how abandoned a lot of folks feel by the party.
Totally. Look, we got a lot of work to do. That's part of why I ran for this role. Is I know in order for us to successfully address gun violence, in my opinion, we have to have a stronger Democratic Party, and we need to have young people as part of that coalition. I think right now, a major part of what we have to address is the fact that there's been a complete and total collapse of faith in institutions across the board. It's not just the Democratic Party, it's the Republican Party, it's every institution, right? All of it. People do not trust institutions, they trust people. And I think one of the most important things that we need to be doing right now that the party is not, because part of it is the role of the party, but more than anything, it's the role of our elected officials within the party. We've got to be more direct on social media with our local elected officials, our state elected officials, and our members of Congress. In the way, even if it's not with the same policies as AOC, for example, I think she does an excellent job of telling people what is going on and speaking to them directly and making them feel heard. And in a time where there is so much disinformation, there are so many lies, part of the reason why that happens is because we're out there thinking like, well, if we go and talk on CNN, if we talk on cable news, if we talk on local news, that's going to be what gets voters. Because in local primaries, a lot of the time, that is the case, right? If you spend $1 million in a state legislative race on local TV ads, you're probably going to move it a few points if you have the right message. But the reality is the primary electorate of the Democratic Party is not the general electorate of a presidential election. We had $2 billion to spend this election. And look at the result. We didn't lose this because Donald Trump necessarily had more money than us. It's because he understood what our party still fails to realize at this point, in part because it doesn't make TV consultants rich, which is the fact that the reason why you raise money is to get attention. If you were able to get attention with less money, if you're able to get more attention with less money, that is a better use of your time. That is what Donald Trump understands. And right now, we're still playing with a 20th century playbook, in my opinion, behind the scenes, where we think the way we're going to get young voters is spending tons of money on ads to appeal to them in this very focus grouped and hammered down message. The reality is, if you have a good message for young people, you don't need to advertise it because they will advertise it for you, right? That's what we did with the March for Our Lives. It was a message that resonated with them, that was something that they could believe in. And the reason why it worked is because for a split second there, we made people believe that change just might be possible on this issue, that people for so long thought would never change. And what I'm trying to do in this position in the party is to re-inspire our country into believing what is possible if we win, not just defending current institutions. These institutions do need reform. I don't think they need to be abolished by any means, but they do need reform. And this idea that we just need to defend all of them, I think is wrong, in my opinion. We do need to do a lot of work there. And what we do in order to communicate that is, if you're a member of Congress, if you're a local elected official, if you're a state legislator, do direct-to-cameras. Talk about what is going on in your city. A great example of exactly, in my opinion, what we need to be doing, regardless of whether or not you have the same policy positions as a lot of people that I'm mentioning, is somebody like Shi Asi, who's a city council member in New York City. He got elected as an activist from the movement for racial justice after 2020. And one thing that he did is, in New York City, they have something called broker fees. Very unpopular. And he organized on TikTok and said, hey, there's all this great info. There's a meeting that's happening to discuss how we can end broker fees. But nobody ever shows up to it other than a bunch of real estate developers and other people that have self-interest in keeping broker fees. And he was able to get a line of 500 plus people to show up on a random, I think, weekday and just fill the entire room. And he was able to tell a story of how they built momentum. And he would say directly to the camera, like, this is what we're doing this week. This is where we are in the campaign to end broker fees. And then he succeeded and did end them in the city, at least on tenants in particular. And that kind of message of showing the enemy how you can organize, other than just fucking donating, frankly, right? How you can organize to show up and how we won is exactly what I think we need to be doing as a party to combat that disinformation and repeatedly drill into voters' heads that we are delivering and fighting for them. Because we're doing a lot of this, we're just failing to communicate it a lot of the time.
Thank you.
On that note, I do think we are unfortunately out of time for this conversation, but thank you all so much for joining us here today, and thank you, David, for coming and chatting with us here on campus.